Today I'm replacing the alternator on my 2013 Toyota Corolla. The first thing you want to do is disconnect the battery so you don't shock yourself or get any sparks flying. Then we will remove the serpentine belt that goes around the alternator pulley. If you need a belt, like it's cracked or old, replacing the belt and the alternator together are a great idea since you already have to loosen the belt in order to remove the alternator. You can also Google a photo for how the belt is routed if yours is shredded or removed before you can jot a little photo down, but here's mine. Alright, so here we are under the hood. Luckily the alternator is right here on top, so hopefully not too much of a pain in the butt. First thing I want to do is pop this shield up. It just has like plastic grommets, but get that guy out of the way. Then we have our belt tensioner right here, and we'll see what other bolts are holding the alternator in place. To disconnect the battery, you need a 10mm socket or wrench. I'm just taking the ground off with a negative cable, setting that out of the way to the side so we don't get any sparks flying. On the alternator, there's a nut under this cover, and then I need to disconnect this connector. Just loosen that guy, you don't have to. Another thing I like to do before I get started is check my new parts, make sure it looks like I have the right one. This guy has a pulley on him too, so that's helpful. We've got the same connector on the back and the nut, and it looks like we're good. There's going to be a slide bolt across the bottom of the alternator. This bushing will come further in when you tighten that bolt to hold it closer, but we're going to go down and loosen this one too before we try and take the belt off. These two upper bolts on the tensioner are 12mm, and then this lower one, try and show you. This guy right here is a 14mm, and a deep socket will make it easier. Alright, so we have that bottom bolt loose. Then we can switch to our 12mm and spin this tensioner in so that the alternator will rock forward and loosen the belt. Now that I have both of those loose, you can see how it rocks the alternator to tension the belt. Once you have the belt loose and off, then we want to take this 12mm bolt all the way out and the 14mm hinge pin bolt all the way out so we can remove the alternator. We might have to take this bracket too, depending on if we have enough room to pull this up. This connector has a push pin on the side. Might have to get a pick and help it to cooperate with you. There we go. See, he's got a push pin. So disconnect the connector. Then I need to try and pry this gray cover back so I can get the nut loose. It would help if it was warmer than 40 degrees, but here we are. I call this guy the booger picker. If you don't have one, no big deal. You can try it with a flathead screwdriver, but basically pry this guy around so that you can reach this 10mm nut to disconnect the alternator. Now we can get the harness out of the way. I'm gonna go ahead and just take this tensioner out so I'm not fighting against it. So 12mm bolt right here. Pay attention. If these are different lengths, then there is a 12mm bolt under that long one right here. And we can sneak this whole tensioner out. This guy is definitely shorter, so I'm going to put him where he goes so there's no confusion when we go back together. Next, I take this 14mm hinge pin bolt out, and then I should be able to loosen and remove the alternator. Bit of a tedious process, but I'm switching to a stubby ratchet and a not deep 14mm socket so I don't get a deep socket and my ratchet stuck in there and I have room to pull the belt. If you feel the bolt binding, you can rock the alternator back and forth to loosen it up, but I finally got it out. Now, we should be able to pop the alternator off that bushing and up out of our way. Might need to pry. Gently, being careful of everything else in the engine compartment. Pry between the bushing and the alternator until you can get it off and up. I missed one last 10mm bolt that is holding the harness in place on the alternator. Alright, set this guy aside so you know where to find him later. Then we can really get the harness out of our way and hopefully get the alternator up. Alright, it helps if you get this part out first before this guy, because if you pry up, then you don't have room. But voila, our alternator is removed. Now we will install the next one. This bushing that I was showing you is the reason it was such a pain in the butt to come out. The new one doesn't have this bushing screwed in yet, so it should be easier to line up. Place the alternator in. See how I've got this where it needs to be. Now I will start that bolt. Don't tighten anything down until you have every bolt started by hand. See if I can do this one-handed. We'll give it a shot. There we go. Once you have it started by hand, you can ratchet it in a few turns. Make sure it's started. We will not fully tighten it until we get the belt tensioner back on. Slide this guy behind. Start this bolt. All of this is easier with two hands. And we want to tilt the alternator out so we can start the tensioner bolt. All right, everything is started and in place. Nothing is tightened down yet. That will be our final step. Next step though is to route the belt in place. Screw this guy in a little bit more. Here's the new belt. If you had an old belt, you could compare them length and make sure that you're good. Reasons you would replace the belt: if these ribs are cracked or there's crystal deposits, then it could be slipping. Or if a pulley seizes and shreds your belt, then you would have to replace it. So I'm gonna get this down around the crankshaft and in place. If you can access underneath, it's easier to get down here and make sure that the crankshaft pulley has the belt in the right place. And we'll go to the top and sneak it up through. You wanna spin this guy way out if you haven't already, so that the alternator can go as far forward as possible, so you're not fighting it to put the belt on. See how that tilts in? All right, you want to put the belt on the crankshaft pulley and the AC compressor first. Then around the alternator, you do the water pump last, since this pulley's smooth and you don't have a big hump to get over. Go down and make sure everything is correctly on the pulleys where it needs to be. Looking good on the alternator, etc. And then we can start spinning this guy in to tension the belt. Go ahead and tighten this 12mm down, since it's only holding the bracket, not the actual alternator. And we'll spin this guy in. You want to have the belt tensioned tight enough that you can still turn it, but not so loose that it squeals. Also double check that make sure you get this 14 all the way tight. It'll start to feel like it's binding on the last few threads as it pulls that bushing in tighter, but we're good there. Then we want to tighten this 12 for the top of the tensioner. This guy is already tight. Then we can go ahead and put the harness on. For the harness, we're going to put this 10mm hold down bolt in place first. Get that started. Then we will plug in this connector. Get that 10 tight, and we'll plug in this connector. Make sure that you hear it click into place. Then my alternator comes with a new 10mm nut for this. Tighten this down, reconnect the battery, and fire it up. Flop this cover back over, that's also clicking in place. Then we reconnect the battery. All right, I had to jumpstart the vehicle because the battery was so dead. I have this little tester that checks the alternator. Before, when I had the vehicle running, it was lit up saying not charging, field open. You can see, I guess you can't. Anyways, no lights are on, so it looks good. We may still have to replace the battery if it was run down too much by the alternator dying, but that's a whole other video. You want to make sure that your belt is lined up on all of the pulleys and not making any noise. You want to go for a test drive. Sitting here and letting it oil or idle doesn't let your alternator charge your battery. I'm pretty sure test drive is the best move, but that is how you replace the alternator. Test drive the vehicle, make sure you got all your tools out of place and that it restarts, then you should be good to go.